welcome, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for agreeing to talk to me about Learn Through Play.
Sure.
I have to say that I'm quite excited to be able to talk to you. You've done a lot of research in the subject of Learn Through Play, written a lot of papers, a lot of books. So it's really exciting to be able to talk to you. I wanted to ask you, what were your favorite games when you were a kid growing up? And if you think children will benefit from playing them, if they're still playing them, or if you think something changed in that.
My favorite games when I was a child. Well, my earliest memories of playing games was chasing girls. This was when I was probably about 5 years old, and at playtime at school, our favorite game was for the boys to chase the girls, who would scream a lot and then disappear into the girls' toilets, where we weren't allowed to go, obviously. So that was their refuge. And I remember playing a game called British Bulldog. Don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, not really. Can you tell me a little bit more about it?
It's a highly competitive game. I think I've got quite a competitive personality, probably.
I like those too.
Where you start off with one person who is the bulldog, and everybody else is lined up at one end of the playground. This is another school game on a playground, and what you have to do is run from one end of the playground to the other without getting tagged by the bulldog.
All right.
If he tags you, then you become another bulldog. So gradually, the number of people trying to get from one end to the other, I can't remember what they were called, gets fewer and fewer, and the number of bulldogs gets bigger and bigger. However, the bulldogs have to hold hands, so there's
a level of complication for them too, because otherwise it would be too easy for them.
Yes, if they could spread out and get everybody.
Yeah, we had something. I remember playing something similar back in Italy, but I absolutely don't remember the name of it. But it's very interesting that like these types of games, when you grow up, seem to be like the same everywhere you are, everywhere you go.
Yeah.
Like hide and seek. I remember when I was a child, I was playing a lot outdoors with all the kids that were part of the neighborhood. And we would spend countless hours, like behind cars. It would get even a little bit dangerous sometimes, but it was such a thrill.
The other games I remember playing were sort of, I suppose, variations on chasing games. So, for example, I was lucky until the age of 10. I lived on a little estate at the end of a large city, but we had open farm fields.
No, that's great.
And we used to play in the fields, and some of the fields were not farmed, they were just grass, and they were quite high grass, so you could hide in them. So we would play games which were variously called Cowboys and Indians, or I don't know, Earth people and spacemen, or aliens. And it was basically, the game was that you had to creep up behind somebody and tag them, and then they were dead.
That's amazing. It's just a great way to play with the environment, I think. How do you think kids play today? Do they still interact with the environment as much? What is your take?
I think the problem is things have got much more kind of, as it were, organized. So these days children are expected to play in a playground that's been specially designed. And I think that tends to limit the play. You're on the swings, or you're on the roundabout, or you're on the slide, and really there's only one thing you can do with it. Whereas when you're when, as my experience as a child, just playing in the fields and making up our own games, it was much more free and varied and creative. You know, and it was accepted that children. I mean, of course, there wasn't the traffic. I was born in 1948, so my early childhood was during the 1950s. There wasn't nearly the amount of traffic, so you could play out in the street.
Yeah.
You know, perfectly safely. You know, because there'd only be one car coming along every half an hour, and when it did, it'd be going at 20 miles an hour. You know, making a lot of noise. So
yeah.
Avoided.
There's two things that what you just said makes me think about the controlling kind of the freedom that kids had before, also in terms of space, but also in terms of control in the games or in the settings. I was reading one of the papers of Paddle, and one of the things that left me like really think was this kind of conditioned play, so that's good that a game has a set of rules, but then the kid needs to be free to make mistakes, create things, do things in a different way, just make it their own. And I think now parents maybe tend to be a bit too much controlling. I don't know. This is my take from being someone born in the 1990s and seeing, for example, other kids that are now maybe like in 10 years old, 12, and I see the way that they play and the way that their parents control the way that they play. And you see this in the research done at the institute.
Yeah, this is very well evidenced. It's not something we particularly did in Pedal, or I've done subsequently. Now I'm retired, but there's a massive evidence on this. Children are very much more heavily supervised, and they're very much more heavily what's the word? Organized, I suppose. You know, so for example, a lot of children in normal times when they're going to school on a daily basis, they would stay at school and do clubs. You know, so they'd play these, or they'd go somewhere else. You know, like they'd have music lessons or ballet dance lessons or sports clubs or whatever. It's much more organized now than it was in my own personal childhood. There was very little of that, and it was almost all just organized, amongst the children who lived in your street or on your estate or whatever. So yeah, it was much more child initiated and child organized than it is these days. And there's quite a, there's evidence as well about, for example, and for very understandable reasons, I was allowed, for example, from a very young age, I went to school on my own. I walked on my own, or I later, when I was sort of from about the age of 10 or 11, I cycled to school and back on my own.
Yes.
And that was, that was the dominant. I would go to school that was, say, 2 miles away, and I would walk, as a 6 or 7 year old. I mean, these days, children, and you meet friends on the way. And I mean, one of my favourite games, actually, you've reminded me of, is I pretended to be a world famous marathon runner. There was a man called Emil Zatopek, who was I think from Eastern Europe somewhere, and he used to win all the 10,000 meters and the marathon races at the time. And I used to run everywhere as a young child. And in my head, I mean, on the outside, you could just see this small boy running.
Yeah.
On the inside, in my own head, I was in a marathon race, and I was Emil Zatopek, and I was winning the race. And I think a lot, things went on then, when not really obvious, if you're just watching what's happening. But the amount of freedom, these days, children hardly walk anywhere. They're taken in a car, and that the number of children who are taken to school in a car and picked up and so on, you know. So even that bit of freedom and individual responsibility is taken away from children very often for understandable reasons about, you know, the increased traffic and an increased perception of various kind of dangers, which,
yes,
you know, which are largely erroneous. Actually, the dangers haven't increased, but the media.
yes, that was actually something I was thinking, because perception is not really an actual thing. And I mean, it might be in some places. And this actually makes me think, so what do you know are the negative consequences of this kind of having something too structured, not giving children enough freedom? What does that cause then in the future for that child?
Well, the one thing that the two areas that people have done research on this are one related to children's mental health, which of course is currently a very you know, big issue that's been brought by the restrictions, you know, because of the COVID crisis. And we certainly have good evidence that outdoor adventurous play is where children build their resilience and their self-confidence often, and a lot of their social skills and these kinds of things. But mostly, you know, it's mostly good for children's mental health and self-esteem. And that's been lost. It's been exacerbated by the COVID crisis, but it had been lost very largely anyway. And so there's lots of movements, of course, nationally and internationally, forest schools, adventure parks, you know, specific things being provided for young children now to try and counter this loss. But I think for the vast majority of children, it's still a loss. And the other area, which has been more an area of my own research, is in terms of children developing what we call self-regulation. And self-regulation is sometimes thought, the kind of popular media and in the policy arena, politicians and so on, to be simply concerned with children behaving themselves, you know, regulating their behavior. But actually it's much more fundamental and much more important than that, because it's about being aware of and being in control of your own mental activity. So it relates to everything you do, you know, having a conversation like we're having now, reading, writing, mathematics, social interaction, your emotional life, regulating your emotions and so on. It's absolutely vast, and has a very profound long-term impact on both on children's academic progress, you know, that would be measured in exam results and this kind of thing, but also in their emotional well-being and their mental health, which would, you know, cash out in terms of their abilities, in terms of their social relationships, their abilities to work in groups, their emotional stability, their ability to form friendships and maintain friendships and intimate relationships, and all those kinds of, you know, really important, what are sometimes referred to as soft skills, or 21st century skills, some people call them, because, you know, we all work in collaboration with others, you know, very much these days. And all of those things are supported by children having time when they are controlling the agenda, you know, when they're making the decisions about what they're doing. And that could be in a playful context, but it could also be things like going to the seaside with the family. I mean, obviously a lot of play is generated, but just having the freedom to, you know, it's an environment in which parents are allowed, you know, feel happy to allow their children.
To decide, what do we do today? Something that instead of actually scheduling everything and say, today we're going to do this, today we're going to do that. And then when the kids grows up, then they're still looking for that someone to tell them what to do because they haven't had the chance to develop that themselves. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, and it can even be true not just of going to the beach or going to the zoo or something like that, but going to a museum. So it can be an educational outing, but still, if you watch parents with their children in a museum, you can see that the child is having much more of a say in, you know, where they go, what they look at, what they talk about. You know, the agenda of the day is much more, you know, democratically negotiated rather than, you know, children's normal day. And I think this is true in general life, but I think it's true in schooling as well. Certainly in the UK, there's much less child initiation. There's much less play in schools. When, I mean, even as recently as the 1970s, I say recently, I mean that's 50 years ago now, isn't it? But you know, within my own lifetime, when I was a primary school teacher in the 1970s and early 80s, and we play-based learning was a characteristic of a primary school in the UK, right through to year 5, year 6, right till, you know, through till the end when children were 9, 10, and 11. These days, a playful approach to learning in many schools ends at the point when children leave the reception class and go into year 1. You know, so you know, when children are 5, so, you know, like 5 years earlier than it used to. And children are much more scheduled. You know, they have the literacy hour, the numeracy hour. You know, the timetable is much more rigid.
It was actually the same in Italy, where I did my whole kind of primary education.
Right.
And there was really, you were just sitting there in a class of 20 or 30 kids, and you had one teacher that would talk to you for 1 hour, 2 hours, and then you would just absorb things, but there's nothing to keep you entertained in a way, like or to make you engage with what is being taught and what is being said, and that continues up to like high school and even a university. In Italy, you still have that kind of, okay, you're the student, you're listening. In the UK, it's a little bit better at university because at least you have the tutoring classes, or, you know, where you have actually an exchange where students really learn about the lesson or whatever at home, and then they come back and they talk to the tutor and they really like explore the subject. And that I remember when I was studying in the UK, that I really liked, because it was a way of really confronting your opinion or how you interpret to other people, and it was really a discussion to be had. So that was very nice. But in terms of really playful activities, not even the physical education was really like, I don't know, it was, I don't think, for example, it's done well, or we can say there's much to be improved. Let's say system that is Italian, what I come from.
Yeah, no, I think it's very similar all over the world, sadly. I mean, I've been fortunate to be able to visit preschools, kindergartens, and primary schools in quite a number of countries around the world, in the Far East, in Africa, in South Africa, in Canada, and so on. In other countries in Europe, and it's very, very consistent, rather traditional delivery model of education throughout the world. You know, the teacher speaks or shows or demonstrates, and you watch, you listen. There's an old Chinese proverb, isn't there? I can't remember the detail now, but it finishes up with something about you watch and you remember, you listen and whatever, and it finishes up with you do and you understand. You know,
That's it. But it's true with everything.
Yeah.
Until you actually do something, you really realize all the things. I can apply this, for example, to marketing. What I studied for my master's, and I remember again absorbing concepts and thinking and whatever, and like really abstract things, even though of course you know there were practical examples and everything. And then when I actually went learning and doing things within a company, then I really, okay, that thing that I read there, that paper, that's what it meant.
Yes.
And then you really,
now
you really,
yeah,
it's really like that.
absolutely.
I read an article when I actually found your name in it. It was an article from The Guardian and was talking about a Finnish example of education. Somehow the fact that they incorporate a more playful element.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think of that model? Do you think they are ahead, and why?
Well, a colleague of mine did a study of the Finnish education system, and when he was asked to say why it was like that, his response was because they got Calvinism, which is one of the, you know, in the Reformation, where there was Luther, but there was also Calvin, and there were various other. So there were various, you know, new Protestant religions, and I think Calvinism embodies the idea of leading the good life, or something like that, and getting a good education is part of leading a good life. I'm not a theologian, so I don't know the details, but so it's a fundamental cultural difference.
If I remember correctly from back in the day, it's also because it gives the person more freedom to decide what's good for them, isn't it?
Yes, rather than, you know,
imposing something.
Yes, in some religious persuasions, you are told what to do much more. Yes. Anyway, but in terms of the educational system, I think the really key difference that makes most of the difference in Finland, and this is true in one or two other countries as well. Estonia is another example, where the children start what I might describe as formal education later than they do in the UK and in quite a lot of other countries. So in the UK, we, as I was saying to you, we have children, they're in preschool or nursery until 4. Then at 4 they enter what's called the reception class, which is the first class in a primary school, and then they go into year 1 when they're a 5-year-old and go to become 6 in that year.
Yeah.
And it used to be the case, as I said, you know, even as recently as the 70s and 80s, the play-based approach to learning would continue right through the primary school. Now it stops in reception class, and even the reception classes, when children are still 4, there's a lot less play than there used to be. And certainly by the time they enter year 1, then there's no, you know, there's almost no provision at all for any kind of playful activity, apart from when they're in the playground. In Finland and Estonia and one or two other countries, Singapore is another example, the transition into formal education, where you're being deliberately taught something by a teacher in that very delivery kind of way, isn't until 7. So that it means that the children, of course, they all have a very well funded and provisioned preschool sector as well. So children in Finland can go to a preschool or a day nursery or something like that from 6 months, and they can stay in that kind of preschool setting, play-based, until they go to school in the year when they start out as 6-year-olds and become 7-year-olds. So that's actually 2 years later than we do in the UK. And they don't, and they, of course, there's all sorts of, people worry, say things like, oh, but, they need to start learning to read and write and so on, but all the evidence is, I mean, of course, in the preschools, there is lots of what we call pre-literacy and pre-numeracy activities. Children have, read stories and they do all sorts of games and so on. And I mean, life is mathematical, so you're forever, talking about how big something is or how wide it is or whatever. So there's all that kind of informal, linguistic learning, oral language, pre-literacy. There's all that informal mathematical learning. There's all sorts of informal social learning, physical learning, learning about scientific aspects of the world. All that's going on, but in a play-based manner. And all the evidence is that in that context, what happens is when you start introducing children to formal learning at the age of 6 or 7, they pick it up really easily. And not only do they pick it up really easily, but they nearly all pick it up really easily.
Okay.
Problem with starting too early, which is what we do in the UK and in a lot of countries, is that you're asking children to do things that they're not developmentally ready to do.
Yeah.
So they struggle. And of course, the last thing you want, if you're wanting a child to develop as a competent and enthusiastic reader or writer or mathematician or scientist, is for their first experience of it to be one in which they find it difficult, where they fail, where they're conscious that other children are doing it better than they are, and all this sort of thing. And so there's some nice evidence, actually, a lot of it from New Zealand, where they start later. The children who start later find it easier and more confident about it, and by the age of 11, by the time they're finishing primary school, they're more advanced in their reading, their writing, and their mathematics than the children are who started earlier.
Yeah.
And didn't have that extra 2 years of play-based learning. So I mean, it's the evidence is so strong that and it's incredibly compelling. It's really tragic, I think, that because most educational systems in the world are not controlled by educationalists or developmental psychologists, sadly. They're controlled by politicians.
Yeah.
Politicians, as I was once told at a meeting with some politicians a long time ago, yes, but as a politician I have to consider other sorts of evidence. By which he meant what will get me elected, so they're they're the servants of public opinion. They don't, contrary to, I mean, even in the latest COVID crisis in the UK, our politicians have been saying we're following the science, and actually they're not at all. They're continually not following the science, because what they're really bothered about is not what the scientists think, but what the general public think. We get there in the end, of course. Eventually, what they do usually works, so then they have to do something else. They finish up eventually having to do the right thing, because that's what will actually make a difference. But it can be very, very delayed, which is a shame.
It is a real shame. And the next thing that is coming in my head is, okay, if this is situation in schools, is there a way that maybe parents can make up for the flaws, let's say, in the educational system in the house, and maybe implement more learn through play in the household.
Yeah, absolutely. There's I mean the other thing which is great news for a lot of children, but really unfortunately bad news for others, is that actually the home and what happens in the home and the quality of your relationship with your parents and how playful your parents are all have much more impact on you than what happens in school, particularly what happens in the first few years of life.
Yeah.
Really sets up how well you're going to do through the rest of it. And what most education systems do, which is tragic, is they take children who arrive in the education system having had a really excellent experience in their home with their parents, which is playful, educational, culturally rich, and all the rest of it. They do really well in the education system, and the children who come from homes where that none of those things are true do really poorly. And most education systems take children, obviously, who are at a variety of levels.
Yeah.
And what they do, what the education system achieves, is to simply exacerbate those differences. So if you're doing it on a graph, you'd have the most developmentally advanced child here and the least here, and by the end of the education system, they're much further apart. There are very few educational systems that don't just make the divide worse. There are some examples of where they don't, and these tend to be again the countries where children start school later and get more of the sort of richness of play based, because of course if you've got 3, 4, 5 years of play based experience in some sort of institutional setting in a preschool or a kindergarten, that can have a big effect and can to some extent remediate having had not the most advantaged home background. But if it's only for 1 year or 2 years, then of course it won't. It's not enough. So
I'm thinking about a lot of examples, especially like from my own childhood, and I remember, of course, having we in Italy have scuola materna, which is the preschool, and then when you're 5 or 6, you go to elementary school. And I remember playing a lot. I remember like between 3 and 4 and 5, I think it's 3 years, really playing with other children. And of course we were supervised, and some activities were like structured, but there was a lot of freedom. And I remember when I got into elementary school, of course you start like you're sitting somewhere, so you have to stay sitting there for 5 hours, and you have a little break to have a snack or something, and then at lunchtime it was over, and so I would walk back home. And I remember there was, of course, like a lot of difference between the two, but there was even more difference from elementary school to middle school, because by the time I was 11, then I went into middle school, and even there you had even to call the teacher. So before you call it teacher, you call it maestra or maestro, and then you call them professor. So there's also like this kind of they are they, you are you. So this
divide, yes.
And it continues. Of course, university. And I remember I was surprised when talking to professors in the United Kingdom. There wasn't that professor, whatever, because whenever you wrote emails to your professors, dear professor, and you had to like be really formal, otherwise they would reply to your email saying, oh, but you should call me this, you should call me that. It was like really this divide. And I remember it's just, I don't know, wrong, because at 11, 12, 13, you're still like a child. You still need play. You still need, I don't say a maternal figure or a paternal figure, but more maybe of a friend, not like someone that is like, I don't know, tough and is, you have nothing to say. They're just telling you those things and you just take them as they are. Also, no critical thinking, I think, can be born in an environment like that, where you are not allowed to question what a teacher says. You just have to take it because they said it, so it must be right.
I think one of the great things about playful activity is it's very democratizing, I can't remember who it was now, but I think it might have been what's his name, American researcher who I attended a talk he was giving once, and one of the things he said was, I'm sorry I can't remember his name, but it's so true, is that play only works if everybody's enjoying it. You're all when you're playing, you're a volunteer. You're and if it's not working, if the play is not working for you, you stop doing it. And so what you see even in young children is, if they're whatever game they're playing, there's a very clear collaborative effort to get everybody to be enjoying the play, which wouldn't be true, in any other context, really, probably. And it's a very collaborative activity. I mean, of course, you can play on your own as well, but when you're playing with other children, it's a very collaborative activity. I mean, of course, again, it can go wrong. You can get bullying and these kinds of things, but overwhelmingly, predominantly, it's a collaborative activity, and you choose to play with, but you choose who you're going to play with, you choose what you're going to play, and you only do it if you're getting some psychological benefit from it, that you're enjoying it, and it's making you feel good, and all those kinds of positive things that are the foundation for good mental health. So
it brings me to the actual pillars of what is learned through play, which is, it needs to be joyful, and it needs to has to have a meaning. It involves like active and engaged thinking, and then of course the social interactions that you talked about, and so of course, and this degree of like really like making decisions and really being there and deciding, okay, I don't like it anymore, I'm going to get out, or we collaborate together. And
I think the other one that I recognize those 5 characteristics, which been well accepted and written about in a lot of different publications. The one you've not mentioned is iterative, and that's really key, because it's about the notion of learning through mistakes.
Yes.
And in most of education, if you make a mistake, you've got it wrong, and you get a cross instead of a tick. And if you get lots of crosses, you're failing, and that's it. It's very, it's very kind of competitive thing. Whereas when you're playing on your own, trying to build something or make something or draw a picture or whatever, or when you're engaged in genuinely collaborative play, you can do the wrong thing. You can get it wrong. You can make a mistake, but there's no sanction. That's not a problem. That's part of the process. And you have another go, and you try something different. And when you're thinking about what's fundamental in terms of our learning processes as human beings, one of the ways we get better at doing things is by developing new mental strategies. And there's a huge amount of evidence in developmental psychology of children being shown to improve their performance in any particular task, whether it's mathematics or building a model or solving a problem or whatever it is. All sorts of different experiments have been done. And what you see is children, very interesting processes whereby they become increasingly aware of when they've made a mistake. And to begin with, they simply repeat the mistake. But after a while, they try something else. And if that doesn't work, then they try something else. There's a lovely transcript from a study by actually a Russian psychologist called Istomina in 1975. It's published, a long time ago, of a child being involved in a playful memory game. And the game consists of her being given a list of things to buy from a pretend shop, and she has to walk across quite a large hall to get to the pretend shop. So she's got to remember the items. And what you can see is that young children, sort of 3 or 4-year-olds, when they're doing that, by the time they get to the shop, they've not just forgotten the items, they've forgotten why they've gone to the shop, and they start playing shops. But by the age of 5, as young as 5 for some children, you can see them getting so far across the hall, realizing that they've forgotten some of the things they're supposed to be getting. So this is a metacognitive act. This is an act of becoming aware of your own mental state, that I've forgotten this, and going back and asking for the list again and trying a different way of remembering it. So, for example, trying some strategy like saying to themselves what, rather than just listening and then going away, but as the person says, we need eggs, they say, oh yeah, eggs, and we need sausages, oh yeah, sausages, and so on. So they actually say it themselves to themselves, and then they get all the way over and realise and then by then they've remembered nearly everything, but they might still realise, oh, there's one thing I've forgotten. But you can see how they get better at memorising because they try out different ways of doing it as they get older.
And they are free to do so and find it themselves.
So in a playful context, and they become increasingly, develop more strategic ways of doing things. And whenever I'm teaching anybody or giving a lecture or anything about self-regulation, I always get one thing I've often done is get the people involved, the audience or the children or whatever, to do some mental arithmetic for me. And if you do this with adults, like subtract 49 from 83, and you get them to do that in their head, and then you get them to talk to the person sitting next to them about what answer did you get and how did you do it. And the interesting thing is, usually they manage to get the right answer.
Yeah.
But also, they can tell one another how they did it. And quite often, they discovered they did it in a different way. So subtraction, for example, one person will have done it the way they were taught to do it. Say, well, I can't take 9 from 3, so
Yeah.
10. They'll do that in their head, like you would do it if you're writing it down. Another person will say, well, what I did was I counted on. So I started with 49, and I went, well, that's 1 to 50. And then from 50 to 80 is 30, so that's 31. And then I need another 3, so that's 34. So my answer is 34. So they get the same answer, but they do it in a different way. Nobody's taught them, well, apart from the how to write it down, umpteen other ways people do something like that. Some people, will say, oh, well, I won't take 49 from 83, I'll take 50 from 83, that's 33. And then I'll add the one on from there's all sorts of different ways you can do it. people haven't been taught that, but they've worked it out in their heads by this process of what we call metacognition, which is where you become aware of, how well you're getting on with the task, where you are in the task, what you need to do next. All of those things are going on while you're doing it, and you become aware of when it didn't work. So you try something else and it does work. So we become, as adults, we become able to just use just the right strategy for each problem. We've got, very fluently, without we even realize what we're doing. We know how to do something, and we know which strategies to do when, and so on and so forth. And all that is learned, and the learning of it is massively enhanced by learning it in a playful context, when it's okay to do it wrong and then try another way, and so on. So the role of play in supporting children's developing metacognitive and self-regulatory abilities is huge, and my concern is, we have some evidence for this, that children are finished up being less strategic and able, therefore, in their learning than they were, in a more playful, when children had more playful opportunities than, now than they then. They've become worse at these kinds of important things now, which is again a shame and quite tragic for some children. But having a playful family who enable all that to go on, and having plenty of playful preschool experience, all really helps with all of this. We've got very enormously strong evidence about all of this value that play provides in these areas.
And if for all the parents and listening then at home, if they wanted to take part to research, how can they get in touch where they can actually contribute and help with the research that the institute is doing?
PEDAL has a website, and on the website, so it's just if they Google the PEDAL Research Centre at the University of Cambridge, they'll find it on the internet. And on the website, it's got information about all the different ways in which the research group disseminate their research, and all the ways in which we try to provide there's a thing called PEDAL Hub.
Yes.
Which is, as you know, a resource. We collect research from all over the world, and we publish it on the site. We publish, we've got a thing called the Z to A, or is it the A to Z, one or the other way around, of play, where we publish articles in relation to different aspects of play, short articles usually written by members of PEDAL or colleagues, who are play researchers in other institutions, and they usually provide, a brief introduction to the area and then a reading list of articles that you can look at, and all those articles are on the PEDAL Hub for you to access.
I'm going to also put the link of the website
Yes.
on YouTube. David, one last question. So I saw that PEDAL is funded by Legal. I suppose they're very kind of active in the way that they support the center. What is their kind of involvement?
Well, their primary involvement is that they fund the center, and we have, as a consequence, we have ongoing discussions with them about different projects, and so forth. They fund us on a sort of 3 to 5 year cycle. So I think we started off with a 3-year cycle. Now we're in the middle of a 5-year cycle. So we've got funding for, for a 5-year period that's all targeted an agreed set of projects. But of course, we are in fairly regular contact with the Pedal the Lego Foundation, which is their research arm that funds the centre. And so they're kept in touch with what we're doing. We're kept in touch with what they're doing, and of course they work internationally with all sorts of projects all over the world. So that, there's a useful two-way flow of information. We do also, and so we'll make presentations to them. There's an annual conference they run on play that members of Pedal will attend and often present at, and so on. But we are increasingly getting funding from elsewhere for specific projects. So at the moment, we have a number of, they fund a small number of PhD studentships each year within the Pedal. The subject of those PhDs is decided by the centre, not by the foundation. Of course, the other thing that Lego do is if we actually want to use Lego as a research tool, they're very happy to provide us with vast quantities of it. So that's been very useful too. Yeah.
David, thank you so much for your time, for really spending this hour talking with me about Learn and Play.
It's been lovely talking to you.
Same.
Okay, cheers. Thank you. Bye for now.